Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I have the honor of being the moderator for today's education event, Embracing Professionalism in Practice, Why It Matters, along with my colleagues Michelle Carpenter with the College of Registered Nurses, Kelly Kane with the College of Registered Nurses, and Wanda Squires with the College of Licensed Practical Nurses. And this webinar is a collaboration between all of our colleges. Today marks 21 years of this wonderful partnership between our colleges to offer a continuing professional education event for healthcare professionals in this province. We have over 600 healthcare professionals registered for today's event, and it's always so wonderful when we can come together and engage in collaborative learning to enhance our knowledge and skills in providing high-quality services. Before we get into the presentations, I just want to go through a few housekeeping details. So the panel presentation will be approximately 90 minutes, followed by a question and answer period that Michelle and I will moderate. During the presentation, we encourage you to put your questions in the question mark widget to the left of your screen. So you'll see a little box with a question mark, and put your questions in there, and we'll begin asking them at the end of the presentation. To customize your viewing experience, you can resize and move around any of the elements that you see on your screen. So now on to today's topic. Professionalism is not a new or unfamiliar concept. As we know, it's key to the delivery of safe, ethical, and competent services. But what exactly is professionalism in terms of being a regulated professional, and why does it matter? Our panelists today will explore professionalism, how it's defined, discuss some ethical and practice considerations, and encourage reflection on how professionalism is demonstrated in practice. Regardless of your profession or area of practice, we hope that this session reinforces your knowledge and understanding of professionalism, provides some new learning or nuggets of information, encourage critical thinking, and sparks continued conversations amongst colleagues and in the workplace. So we have an excellent panel lined up for this afternoon, and their full bios can be accessed through the bio widget on the platform. However, I just want to take a moment to briefly introduce them. Brenda Carroll is the Director of Professional Conduct Review with the College of Registered Nurses, Newfoundland and Labrador. Amanda Jennings is the Senior Director of Provincial Clinical Practice with NL Health Services. And Simone Pelly is a private practitioner and chair of the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers Ethics Committee. So what a truly wonderful panel we have for this afternoon. But before we jump into the panel presentations, we would like to get you engaged and invite you to take part in our first polling question. So you should see that question come up now in a few seconds. And we just want to get your thoughts and how familiar you are with the specific content of your professional codes of ethics and standards of practice. So I'll just give you a few moments to fill in. The options are very familiar, somewhat familiar, and not familiar. So if people could just choose an option there, and we'll report back once we get all the results in. Okay, we're getting some results in there now. Thank you, everyone. We'll just give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think the polling has stopped moving, so I'm just going to push the results to the audience. So we had 48 of our participants on today said they were very, very familiar with the content of their professional code of ethics and standards of practice, and 111 who indicated they were somewhat familiar with their code of ethics and standards of practice, and we had 0 who said they were not familiar. So that's great. So our panelists will certainly be speaking more about the code of ethics and standards of practice as they go through. So thank you for taking part in the first panel. And I'm now going to pass things over to Michelle to begin the panel presentations.
Thanks, Annette. Our vision for this event was to address some of the ethical and practice considerations as it relates to professionalism and provide an opportunity for knowledge exchange, reflection, and learning. I'm very much looking forward to the knowledge that will be provided today by our speakers and for the case scenario discussions that will follow the presentations. To begin, I will now invite Simone Pelli to begin the panel presentation as the first presenter.
Great, thank you. In his acceptance speech, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel said, "One person of integrity can make a difference." The Oxford Dictionary defines integrity as the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. Value 4 of the Canadian Association of Code of Ethics is integrity in professional practice. As we discuss embracing professionalism, why it matters, I would invite you to consider being that one person. I'm going to invite you to be that one person who must speak up and address directly an ethical limitation to a client or patient, or to be that one person who must speak up and address directly unprofessional behavior in the workplace, or even to be that one person who must be brutally honest with themselves and address directly an internal integrity issue, and then course correct, even if there will be professional regulatory consequences. My hope for this panel discussion today is that we inspire you to be that person. And if you're already that one person, you don't have to go at it alone. Access your employee assistance programs for mental health support. Seek colleagues out in your workplace who also uphold professionalism, and connect with your professional regulatory body and get involved. They always need people just like you. The term professional can be used as a descriptive word for anyone's behavior, or even in their appearance or dress in a work setting. But for today's discussion, I'm going to use the definition provided by the Social Work Dictionary, 6th edition. An individual who qualifies for membership in a specific profession and uses its practices, knowledges, and skills to provide services, and in doing so, always adheres to its values and code of ethics. Throughout today's panel discussion, I will be speaking specifically to the social work profession, as I am a registered member, but I will also reference the Code of Ethics for today's partnering professions of registered nurses and the Code of Ethics for licensed practical nurses. As all three share ethics, values, and principles that we are to uphold throughout the course of our careers. And I'll also be referencing the many practice resources that are available on the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers website. So social work is a regulated profession in Newfoundland and Labrador. And this means that we're governed by provincial legislation titled An Act Respecting the Practice of Social Work, the Social Workers Act. Social workers are required to be knowledgeable of and adhere to the Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, the Canadian Association Social Workers Guidelines of Ethical Practice, and the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers Standards of Practice. This then leads us to the definition of professionalism, which is the degree to which an individual possesses and uses the knowledge, skills, and qualifications of a professional and adheres to its values and ethics when serving the client. The CSW Code of Ethics 2005 states in its first few sentences, ethical behavior lies at the course of every profession. The Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics set forth the values and principles to guide social workers' professional conduct. And it goes on to further say, a code of ethics cannot guarantee ethical behavior. Ethical behavior comes from a social worker's, or I'll also insert any professional's, individual commitment to engage in ethical practice. There is no question that in our present day, there are immense human resource and service resource pressures in employment settings. But professionalism is not optional. Even in current employment market pressures, professionals are required to have, and I'm going to quote one of my social work colleagues at the NLCSW, Phil O'Neill, in a Practice Matters document, where he says social workers, but I'll also add all professionals, are required to have the capacity and moral competence to think and make choices, sometimes amongst alternative and competing courses of action, and ultimately choosing what is right based on adherence to their professional and ethical responsibilities. So here are the 3 codes of ethics for the partnering professions in this panel discussion today. And I've also been made aware that there are likely other professionals attending today. And of course, you're very welcome to be here. And I can confidently say that your code of ethics will share in the values and principles outlined in these 3 codes of ethics featured on the slide. And I also want to note that the Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics was just updated this year, and the Newfoundland Labrador College will be implementing this code on March 1st. There's a lot of great information about the code on the CSW website, and of course, it also speaks to professional integrity in professional practice. So why a code of ethics? A research study in 2009 that was conducted by the NLCSW's Executive Director and Registrar, Lisa Crockwell, and the NLCSW's Associate Director of Policy and Practice, Annette Johns, on the use of the CSW Code of Ethics in social work practice in Newfoundland and Labrador, found that when asked what would be most helpful to them when resolving an ethical dilemma, around 6% of practicing social work respondents indicated the Code of Ethics as their first choice. Now, it's also important to note that in the qualitative portion of this study, respondents did reference the code and they used it during the process of consultation. But the code wasn't the first point of reference. And that was a little surprising to me, considering each year as registered social workers, in our annual renewal of registration, we are to affirm the commitment to be aware of and adhere to CSW Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Ethical Practice. I suspect everyone attending today's discussion was drawn to their respective profession due to personality traits that are high in compassion and the desire to serve humanity. But even with such strong personal values, we're still all human, and there are many variables at play when we evaluate situations from an ethical or moral perspective. And we can fall prey to our gut instincts, personalities, personal or religious values, or cultural norms that can all impact or even interfere with professionalism. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book in 2012, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, in that he proposes that our intuitions come first. That's our gut instinct. Whereas strategic reasoning comes second. His review of the experimental research demonstrated that our brains evaluate instantly and constantly. Social and political judgments depend heavily on quick intuitive flashes. And even our bodily states sometimes influence our moral judgments. He actually goes further into citing a study that demonstrated that bad smells and tastes can actually make people more judgmental. So therefore, documents, codes of ethics, and professional standards of practices can provide a framework in how we are to conduct ourselves to override automatic processes that our brains dictate automatically. So knowing the values and principles in our code of ethics and standards of practice fortify us against ethical drift. And those values and principles keep us from drifting off the road of professionalism, like in this photo, as professional guardrails, so to speak. Now, the term ethical drift is defined in the literature, and I want to note here that this professional literature is actually from a body of literature to the profession of nursing. And it's defined as an erosion of ethical behavior that may go unnoticed by the professional and justified as acceptable, all the while believing that the ethical standard is maintained. The NLCSW Ethics Committee put together a document called Preventing Ethical Drift in Social Work Practice as part of practice resources, as part of one of our series. It's actually called Ethical Compass. And if you are interested in reading that, you can locate that on the NLCSW website. And back in March 2023, you can also find a talk I delivered addressing the necessity of professional self-care to prevent ethical drift on the NLCSW YouTube channel. And it's called Professional Self-Care and Ethical Imperative. So our codes of ethics and standards of professional practices act as guardrails. Guardrails against paternalism, intrusion, coercion, and compulsion. Now, I want to take this time just to review a couple of slides that highlights the partnering professionals code of ethics and kind of the prevailing values and principles of each. So the first slide cites the CASW values. And again, this is the 2005 code. The code now has been updated, and we will adopt it now in the coming month of March. But to review the code that still stands in Newfoundland, value number 1, respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons. Value number 2, pursuit of social justice. Value number 3, service to humanity. 4, integrity of professional practice. 5, confidentiality in professional practice. And 6, competence in professional practice. Now, the Canadian Nurses Association, they also have their code of ethics available on their website, and they cite 7 primary values. And again, we'll see that the themes continue that are thread throughout our shared code of ethics. A, providing safe and compassionate, competent, and ethical care. B, promoting health and well-being. C, promoting and respecting informed decision-making. D, honoring dignity. E, maintaining privacy and confidentiality. F, promoting justice. And G, being accountable. And then the codes of ethics for licensed practical nurses. And they cite responsibility to the public, responsibility to clients, responsibility to the profession, responsibility to colleagues, and responsibility to oneself. So, as professionals, we are to maintain professionalism throughout the course of service provision or treatment of the client or our patient. And that means at the beginning of service, throughout the entire service, and at the completion of service and termination. We are to maintain professionalism at the beginning of service through the process of informed consent, to uphold the values of the inherent dignity and worth of persons and the principles of autonomy and self-determination by discussing the client's rights and responsibilities and providing them with accurate information of the nature of the service being provided, how information will be recorded, and who will have access to it. We're to explain options for service available to clients, the possible risks and benefits of service, the right to a second opinion, the right to view records, and the limits on professional confidentiality. Professional boundaries are to be maintained, and any possible dual relationships in the community or potential conflicts of interest are to be addressed. It's important that clients be given the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. And as professionals, we are to identify ourselves with our registered professional full name so that any disputes or complaints may be managed. We are also to discuss this with the client when and how termination of services are to occur and what can happen if an interruption of service is to occur. Professionalism is to be maintained throughout service provision or treatment. You'll notice that exactly the same elements of professional practice are listed here because each of these elements are to be addressed in an ongoing process as needed and raised throughout the course of treatment. And everyone here today knows time and time again, they do require regular attending to throughout treatment. And of course, the same may require addressing at the end of services with any additional information about the client or patient and how, or with them and how they can engage with those services, re-engage with those services if ever needed again. So knowing what's right doesn't mean much unless you do what's right. So as we continue in our discussion about professionalism and why it matters, I encourage each and every one of us to take our professional values and principles and continue to put them in meaningful and daily action. As Maya Angelou, civil rights activist and American poet, once said, "When we know better, we do better." Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Simone, for leading the panel presentation first off the mark. And we do have a follow-up polling question, actually. We're going to interject some polling questions throughout just to keep everyone engaged. So the next polling question that we do have is, when faced with an ethical issue or practice dilemma, what strategy for resolving the issue do you generally use? So again, we'll just give you a few minutes to provide your response. Do you review your code of ethics and standards? Do you consult with a manager, supervisor, consult with a team member or colleague, discuss it with the client, use regulatory practice resources? So just give you a few minutes to fill that out, particularly as you ponder, Simone's points and presentation of material as well. Again, just give everyone a few minutes to think about that and provide your response. Okay, just waiting for some of the results to come in. So I am seeing some of the results that have come in. So I am just going to push that there to the audience as well. So 16.2% said they would review the code of ethics, that they generally use that. 50% consult with a manager or supervisor, which is not surprising. 27.46 consult with a manager or a team member or a colleague. 0.7% would discuss it with a client, and we didn't have anything that came in under utilizing regulatory practice resources. And that may have been because the screen was cut off. I'm not sure what happened there, but there's no results that came in underneath there. So thank you again for giving us some information in terms of how you resolve practice and ethical dilemmas in practice. And I'll turn it back to Michelle.
Okay. Thanks, Annette. Well, thank you, Simone, for giving such a thought-provoking presentation. I thought it was very insightful, where you talked about it only takes one person to make a difference in regards to professionalism. So, I encourage you to reflect as the listening audience, and will you be that person, that one person that makes a difference? I also thought it was interesting when you said professionalism is at the core of each healthcare professional. I thought that was very thought provoking as well. So now I'm going to welcome our next speaker, Amanda Jennings, to begin her panel presentation.
All right, thank you. Just making sure I have control over the screens here. So I'm going to talk to you about professionalism in 2024. Professionalism certainly has changed over the years since the days of Jane Addams and Florence Nightingale, and rightfully so. Times have changed, education, technology, and professions have to change with them. So I'm going to start by asking you this question. Why did you become a healthcare provider? And I just wanted to take a moment to really reflect on that young professional entering the workforce. What was your motivation? I ask this question to a lot of students and new hires, and I hear a lot of common answers, right? I hear to help, to care for, to advocate for justice, ending abuse. Sometimes I hear stories. My mom was ill. I watched a family struggle. And perhaps some of these words came to mind for you when you look at that question. But interestingly enough, I never hear things like to belittle, to have power over, to hurt, make fun of, ignore, to harm. But we all know from the news or stories that you've heard throughout the years that sometimes this happens. Why? When we start off with all these good intentions. It's ethical drift, like Simone talked about. Ethical drift is that gradual erosion of ethical behavior. And in practice, it refers to that incremental deviation from ethical practice that goes by virtually unnoticed by individuals who justify them. And these deviations become acceptable. That becomes the norm. Now, ethical drift is normal for everyone, and everyone is subjected to it. It happens. It occurs because of our experiences and our exposures. Kellerman describes it as an almost indiscernible move towards cutting corners when making the best of a bad situation. Now, I like that definition because I think it's something that we can relate to. We're understaffed, so we leave something out. Or we skip a step, a piece of documentation, an assessment. And once we've cut the first corner and nothing untoward happened, we believe it's okay to do so. It's called drift because it happens over time, gradually, slowly. And in just culture, it's called at-risk behavior, where we cut a corner. And we do see this in practice. And sometimes the little things lead to bigger things. A little corner, a little more here, and now a whole assessment is missing. So I'm going to just switch gears for you a little bit here. And I want to tell you about my coffee addiction. It's real. It's a thing. I love going to Tim Hortons. I love the smells. I love the sounds. I don't really like the lineup so much, but I can hardly wait to hold that coffee in my hand. And as I enter Tim's, whether I realize it or not, I have an expectation about the service that I'm going to receive when I reach the counter. And if when I get there, the lady that's serving me is wearing a yoga top, or maybe she looks like she just crawled out of bed, and she doesn't acknowledge that I'm standing there, and when she finally does take my order, what do you want? Maybe she rolls her eyes. And then when I'm about to order my donut, she puts her hand up. Just a minute. Well, I'll tell you now, when I leave Tim Hortons and I call my friends, I'm not going to talk about how great the coffee was, how it was just the right amount of hot, or how it was mixed perfectly. I'm going to talk about the service I just received, right? Oh my gosh, you should have seen the lady at Tim Hortons. That's the thing I'm going to walk away with. And we all have expectations about those experiences that we'll have from a service of our local coffee shop. But the thing is, the public's expectation of healthcare providers is so much more, so much more. Healthcare providers are ranked the number one most trusted profession. Now, it's probably not a surprise that we're ranked above lawyers, okay? But it's true. Healthcare providers are ranked the number one most trusted profession. And that's some pretty big shoes to fill. And not only that, but you are the face of the organization. It's not the CEO, it's not the VPs, it's you. The people who interact with the clients daily when they come to our facilities. And they're expecting to interact with a professional. Now, when I say professional, there's a few words that come to mind. Professionalism. And when we say professionalism, there's a few things that float up, like competence. It's a skill expected of a professional. Skill, good judgment, polite behavior. They are the expert, excellence in practice. Their attitude, showing up for work on time. Their appearance, right? Standards of practice. These things come to mind when you hear the word professionalism. Another word is integrity. That firm adherence to that code of moral values, your code of ethics, right? It's the fiber of a person. Honesty speaks to their character, right? So if I can knowingly go into someone's room and do something wrong, that's a low level of integrity. And your integrity speaks a lot to who you are as a person, right? Choosing to make up vital signs or skip an assessment. And integrity is not something I can teach you or give you. It's something that you grow yourself. But it can be modeled. You can watch other people's integrity. And the next word I want to throw out there is respect. And it's really that, respect is that quality state of being esteemed, an expression of high regard, a courteous expression, valuing someone, a reverence. And when you put those three words together, that's really the core of your practice. And if you treat everyone with respect, act with professionalism, and have integrity, you're going to have that professional practice. So why do things go wrong? Well, we already talked about ethical drift and how things deviate slowly, right? Becomes acceptable. And that is a lot of our culture. We are surrounded by it. And one example of deviations in our culture is seen in social media. And social media is everywhere, right? Everyone has a TikTok, a Facebook, a Twitter, or an Instagram. It's a really large part of our culture. And as healthcare providers, you will acquire a litany of stories and experiences over the years. We often say, my gosh, sure, you could write a book on that. And we could, no doubt. But I'm going to share some headlines with you. In each of these cases, the professionals were fired for their social media post. These bankers somehow didn't get the memo. Pretending to be a deadly terrorist group is just plain stupid, not to mention wildly insensitive. A former high school teacher publicly tweeted about her partying lifestyle and drug possession. Communications executive posted a racist tweet and when she boarded a flight to Africa and was promptly fired upon landing. Chances are you've probably worked a job or two that you didn't love, but here's a tip. Don't post about your sheer hatred for your role on Facebook. And this one here. Regardless of what industry you're in, make sure you don't post anything that insults your company's customers. So, why do you think these professionals lost their job? It's because how it reflects on their employers. Go back to the headline of the teacher, right, who posted about her partying lifestyle. She's an adult, she can go to parties, she has social life. But how does that behavior reflect on the school that hired her to teach kindergartners? These examples might seem a little obvious, but we are seeing more and more of this type of behavior in healthcare. And people tend to feel that it's their social media. They can post what they want, not realizing the far-reaching impacts and how it reflects on their profession and their employer. So I'm going to share some memes with you now. Oops. Can you guys still see my post? I might have clicked something wrong in it. Okay, I think you can see it now.
Yes, we can, Amanda.
All right, thank you for that. So this meme here, the social worker I thought I'd be, and the social worker I turned into. It's funny, right? Social workers in the room can relate to this. Absolutely. And memes are everywhere because they're funny, especially to the people that they're about, right? So the social workers will see this on social media, you'll chuckle, and you'll share it. But what does this meme say to the public? That all social workers are drunks? The job's hard. Don't do it. Don't become a social worker. It's not helpful for recruitment. But comedy can really be a double-edged sword. So, we want to be treated with respect. We don't want clients to yell and swear at us. We want to be treated professionally. Yet the images we put out there on social media does not always show us as professionals. These things, like memes, erode the perception of social workers in the public eye over time. This next meme. Patient acting up, they must want to take a ride in the van, the Ativan. It's funny. But picture yourself, your dad's in the hospital, he has dementia, and the nurse is posting this on Facebook. Does that give you comfort as a family member? How do we know that the nurse is not just going to medicate my dad or that he's going to get appropriate care? These things impact the public trust. Become a nurse, they said. It'll be fun, they said. Again, nurses share this. And to this one, it's a breach of employer privacy, right? It's degrading to the patient, who's obviously going through something right now. It's not respectful to the client. A violation of social media policies. In short, you cannot take pictures of your workplace and post it on social media, full stop. Another example I came across when preparing for this was a picture of a trauma room full of IV poles and supplies opened up and the bed is messed up. And the caption was, "When man meets 6 o'clock train." The nurse was fired. There was no patient in the picture, but you could certainly identify who it was. I mean, how many people had got hit by a train that day? And think about the family members. How upsetting to see that on social media. Sometimes people play up their work frustrations on social media as well. This here is a Navy nurse who took some pictures of the children she's looking after. And you could argue that, you can't see the baby's face, so what's the problem? Again, how does this promote public trust? How does this promote the professionalism of nursing? Simply put, it's not an appropriate way to deal with your frustrations. Now, this woman has several of these on TikTok. I'd unplug your vent to charge my cell phone. Me, making sure my patients sleep all night because they kept me up last night. Again, where is the professionalism? How does that impact public trust? Those words, that we just talked about, integrity, respect, professionalism. Well, this is ethical drift. It starts small, grows over time. She thinks she's funny, but this also changes the public's perception of the profession. So while pulling this together, I also came across several examples where the patient had recorded staff. And we're living in a different world. We're seeing this more and more now. In this example, the patient had an endoscopy, and while they were sedated, they recorded the physician saying, "Really, after 5 minutes of talking to you in pre-op, I wanted to punch you in the face and man you up a little." This went to court, and the physician had to pay damages of $500,000. Daily as healthcare providers, multiple times a day, we are faced with decisions where we have to decide if this is right or wrong. Is this an appropriate shortcut? And we talked about how those small deviations become the norm. But when you're faced with these decisions, you have to remember that it's you. It's not your friend, not your unit, your group, your hospital. It's you. And you are accountable for your actions. From an organization perspective, NLHS has adopted the iCare values: innovation, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence. And the reason I bring this up is because essentially this is the expectation of everyone, regardless of your position in healthcare. Every day, we as healthcare providers come across people who are having the worst day of their lives. We don't know what people are holding together on the inside. Every interaction matters. The way you speak, your tone, words, your display of compassion, your professional approach. And another piece that goes hand in hand with the values is the philosophy of patient and family-centered care. Patients or clients, they are the reason that we have jobs. Never forget that. They are the reason we exist. We need to keep focused on that when we're making our decisions, when we answer the phone, the call bell, sit with someone in a meeting. We need to remember that when we get on the elevator, when we're on social media. Patients and their families are the center of everything we do. We are in the service role. We are service providers. Now, NLHS is still becoming one, but there are pockets of excellence in every zone. And one of the things I'm excited to do is to be able to take those pockets of excellence and to share them across the province and show everyone all the great stuff people are doing. And one example I came across was the nod. It's so simple and respectful, and it really should be integrated into the way we just do the work. And it's a simple knock on the door. "Hi, my name's Amanda. I'm your nurse. I'm here to change your IV." It's so respectful of our patients, and we're demonstrating that professional practice. Some more examples was around the bedside handover. Nothing about me without me. Wanting to do bedside handover at the nurse's desk is really more of a staff-focused approach, but including the patient. Come with me, talk with me, makes it a patient-centered approach. Whiteboards, so simple yet so respectful, for a patient to help them remember who their care providers are, and what the key things are that they're going to do that day. Timely documentation audits. Not only is timely documentation a standard and a policy, but it is a professional expectation, right? To show that continuity of care, promote proper treatment. And we have seen documentation not only just late, but we've seen it sent by Facebook Messenger. Things erode over time. Ethical drift. So we talked a little bit about the professionalism and about ethical drift and how we get trapped in social media. And we talked about some organizational expectations. But the truth is, it's not always easy to avoid the uncomfortable situations and get out of them. So how do we actually do it? Well, I'm going to tell you a story about this little girl who went to school every day, and this little boy, Johnny, behind her keeps pulling on her hair. The teacher walks by and doesn't say anything, and this little girl starts to not want to go to school anymore. If we were that little girl's parents, we would be irate. We would be calling the teacher, and we would be expecting her to stop the behavior. It would be unacceptable for the teacher not to address this issue. I call the behavior is really a mindset. Let people know that you called behavior. We are all busy. We're all inundated. But sometimes the things that we're inundated with are a result of not dealing with the issue thoroughly the first time, or maybe not dealing with it at all. This teacher's classroom would be completely out of control if all kids thought that this was an acceptable behavior. The behaviors we walk past are the cultures we set. If we let someone speak to us disrespectfully, we've said, it's okay for you to talk to me that way. If we walk past a nurse on Facebook, we've said, it's okay for you to be on Facebook instead of caring for our patients. One nurse turns into 2, then 4, and everyone's doing it. It becomes the norm. Now, I'll promise you this. The first time you call the behavior, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. But if you don't, it's going to build up. And when the issues or behaviors are not called, it leads to complaints, lack of teamwork, occurrences, errors. It really starts with calling the behavior. And be upfront with people. If I see it, I'll call it. And for the leaders in the room, sometimes you'll get people who come to you, bring you an issue to your attention, and they'll say, no, I don't want you to say anything to them, or I don't want you to actually follow up. But you need to let people know, if you're bringing it to my attention, I have to address it. Regardless of your position in healthcare, everyone needs to be empowered, especially in the uncomfortable. This tool, some of you may be familiar with it, is from Team Steps. And the concept is that anyone can stop the line. Now, when I say stop the line, that's really a manufacturing term referring to factories, stopping the conveyor belt at the factory when you see an error. And it's by saying a simple sentence. I'm concerned with mom visiting the child unsupervised. That should stop someone. I'm uncomfortable giving that much medication to a frail patient. That should make someone pause and rethink. That instrument is no longer sterile. This is a safety issue. Use these sentences to stop the line. And when something does happen, we need to give feedback. And feedback really should be timely. Do it soon after the behavior has occurred. Make sure we're respectful. Focus on the behaviors, not the personal attributes. Relate it to a specific task or behavior that requires an action or corrective improvement. And provide directions for future improvements. And consider their feelings. Delivering difficult information or having an uncomfortable conversation is hard, but do it with fairness and respect. And it's okay to pause and let the message sit. Give it some space. So for example, you might say, can I speak to you for a moment? I really didn't appreciate the way you spoke to me. and just let it sit. The next time you have a concern with my documentation, I would really appreciate if you came and spoke to me directly. Or maybe you say, I would really appreciate if you spoke to me calmly and respectfully. It's calling the behavior. It's not easy to do, but it's ways that you can professionally move past an uncomfortable situation. When I talked to my kids about drugs as they were growing up, I used to tell them to always be prepared with a sentence that you felt comfortable with, that you could say and pull it on a moment's notice. And you didn't have to be there on the spot trying to come up with a sentence or a way to get out of the situation. And when we talked to the kids about that, they came up with, "No thanks, I'm good, more for you." It was a sentence that they felt they could say, they felt comfortable saying, and then they were armed and prepared if ever put in that situation. And so as I think about that in the workplace, here are some sentences I think that we could be using and thinking about how do we have them in our back pocket so when a situation occurs, we can just pull them out. So I'll give you some examples. Your coworker says, "Mr. Ball is coming in to see me next. Oh my gosh, he's such a moron." And you can come back with, "Susan, you should really think about what you just said." It calls the behavior. If you're too stupid to know that that's a fracture symbol, then you shouldn't be working here. Excuse me? I don't allow people to talk to me that way. It puts it back to them. Oh my gosh, our manager is driving me nuts. Yeah, let's not go there. It just moves you past the conversation without engaging into it. And sometimes, you need to be really direct. Just a simple, "I don't appreciate that." Or, "Excuse me, I'm going to have to stop you." So I'm going to conclude this by just bringing you back to that first question. And remember, when you're in those challenging situations, stressful situations, moral and ethical situations, remember why you became a healthcare provider. Take a deep breath. And if you have to, just walk away. All right, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was fabulous. We do have, we're rolling in now to another polling question. So again, just want to get your thoughts, and we will invite the panelists to offer a perspective after everyone gets an opportunity to complete the poll. So the question is, up on the screen there. So you're returning from a leave where you did not have a license to practice. So for example, you are non-practicing retired or maternity leave. Can you practice or participate in workplace orientation online, or in person without renewing your active registration or license to practice? So the options are yes, no, unsure. So we just invite people to give their response, and then we'll invite Simone and Amanda and Brenda, who's up next for the panel, to provide some commentary on that question. I'll just give a few moments for people to put in their comments, or choice, I should say. Give it a few more seconds. Let people think about it a bit, mull it over. Okay, I'm just gonna see. There's always a little delay, so we're just going to leave it open for a couple more seconds for people to put in their response. Okay, I think everyone's commented that wanted to, so just to push that to the audience. So 4.67% said yes, you could do that without renewing your active license or active registration or license to practice. 78.5% said no, and 16.82% said they were unsure. So I invite Brenda, Simone, and Amanda to come back onto the platform. I see Brenda there, but if anyone wants to provide some commentary around that polling question.
I could start because, of course, having your license is a regulatory function of your colleges. So the answer to the question is no. Short answer. Long answer is really anything that you do in relation to your practice as a regulated professional requires you to hold an active practicing license. General rule of thumb, but not foolproof, is if you're getting paid to do something, you're working and you're working in your regulated profession. And be careful because one of the other things we've seen is let's say I'm a registered nurse and I'm working at the bedside, and all of a sudden somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I'm opening up a private care home. I'm looking for someone to be my quality assurance person, or to run my point click care system." You may think, well, I'm not touching patients. I'm not really a nurse. That could be any regulated health professional, not necessarily even a registered nurse. It could be a registered social worker that takes that role on, or an LPN. So it could be anybody. I don't need to be registered. That's not true. If your job description, one of the things we'll look at, it says you need to be a member of a regulated health profession, you need to hold your license. The other component of this is your practice hours. If you're wanting to submit the hours that you're spending doing your work as hours to your college to maintain your standing and be able to obtain a license, if you have requirements for a minimum number of numbers of practice hours in windows of time, if you're going to submit those hours, you have to hold the license while you're working them. You can't submit hours when you're not licensed. So that's a little bit of a practical tip. Anybody else?
I think you covered it perfectly.
Yeah, we deal with this every once in a while. And you know what? Again, practical tip. The most common time we see this is when people go off on a maternity or paternity leave. And they go off on some kind of longer leave. It spans over a renewal period. And all of a sudden, someone comes back to practice and forgets because your email address is your work address. So that's where the reminders for your renewal went. So, another practical tip when you're filling in your online renewal or registration with your college, use an email that you don't have to be at work to access, because those reminders will come to your work email. And if you're on leave, you won't get them. Then you don't renew. Then you go back after your mat leave, and all of a sudden, and these penalties can be huge. I know at the College of Registered Nurses, it used to be $100 a day per day worked with no maximum. So we had people who worked for months and got fines in the thousands of dollars. We have kind of modified that because that didn't feel like right touch regulation to us. But it's different in jurisdictions as far as what the penalties are, but they can be quite significant. And the corollary to it is if you don't have a license, you also don't have liability insurance. So if you're working and you're engaged in some kind of an untoward event and there's a liability that's attached to you, if you don't have your license, you don't have liability insurance, you may not be covered and protected in that regard. So this is one of my soapboxes, which is why I just took over and commandeered the whole conversation.
Someone is asking, is that just for nurses? I don't know if Simone, you wanted to add, or Annette?
No, I think the answer would be directly applicable as well for registered social workers, right? Because the issue there it's talking about, I don't have it right in front of me. Just click off something here. Workplace orientation, right? You're in the workplace. So just as it was said, if you're being paid to practice, then you are in fact practicing, and therefore you are requiring to have your registration. And again, when we're talking about professional liability, the registration and our professional liability insurance have to be in effect.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what the specific question was, but I mean, what around social work, there's no, like Brenda was talking about, the penalties, those kinds of things. It's more getting back into the, if you're returning to practice and workplace orientation is part of practice, then registration will be required. So that's the point from the social work side of things. I'm not sure who asked that question, but there's that penalty piece will be different between our colleges around some of that. But we'll get into questions afterwards. So we'll I guess pass things back to Brenda to continue with the panel presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. Um, as you know, I'm Brenda Carroll. I'm the Director of Professional Conduct Review with the College of Registered Nurses. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I think it's very timely, it's very pertinent, and it reflects one of the things that we are seeing in our conduct review department is more issues coming, more concerns, more complaints that are arising out of these types of situations or issues. I specifically chose this little background for my slide because I felt like it kind of reflected professionalism. There's some pretty clearly defined points, and there's some pretty obvious parts of it. And then there's kind of this messy web of stuff that goes with it. So, um, I just sort of thought, my predecessors gave you a very good idea of the foundations and where the concepts of professionalism have arisen and how they've developed and what they're based upon. And then Amanda gave you a very good overview of professionalism primarily from a workplace perspective. So as the regulator, we have a little bit of a broader mandate, but I wanted to throw these pictures up here and sort of see if everybody could sort of figure out what these individuals have in common. And what it is really all of these individuals have, had a fall from grace, at least temporarily, or been scrutinized in their conduct, comments, behaviors outside of what they're actually known to be sort of employed for or what their professional activity is. So I kind of want to look at professionalism sort of on the outside of the workplace. And people might say that each of these individuals have been a victim of the cancel culture, but really, to be honest with you, they're victims of their own conduct and their own behavior or their own comments. So, what causes someone to be canceled or to be considered unprofessional? When you look at each of these individuals, this is a pretty broad range of things. I do need to preface this, the lawyer in me is coming out. Kevin Spacey was acquitted of the charges of sexual assault. So I do need to put that out there, but he was charged with that. So look at the things that are on this list: body shaming, criticism of political decisions, anti Semitic statements. Among other things, I picked out of the list of Ellen's transgressions, including racism, betrayal of trust and confidence. I mean, there were other issues about bullying and just generally not being a nice person and being elitist, but the betrayal of trust and confidence was one that stood out to me because I think that's a very relevant issue for healthcare providers. The use of performance enhancing drugs, cheating, cutting corners, those kind of concepts. mockery or racism. For those of you who aren't as old as Michelle Carpenter and I, sorry, Michelle, you might not recognize this person. He was a baseball player back in my day. His name was Pete Rose. He's been canceled out of baseball because he had a gambling issue and he was point shaving and betting on games and fixing things. So, dishonesty is in this mix. Infidelity, impaired driving. Now, you know what? Infidelity, I might not care about as your employer. I don't know, but everything is a moving target these days. The one that stood out to me sort of as being really relevant was Don Cherry. I think if you lived in Canada for the last while, you must have been on a rock if you didn't sort of remember this happening. But Don Cherry, a staple of Hockey Night in Canada, a staple of the game that is the centerpiece of Canada, makes a comment on an intermission that Sportsnet comes back and says, the comments made by Mr. Cherry were divisive remarks that do not represent our values. That, I mean, we all remember it. We all remember going, oh, when it happened. And we all kind of went, yep, here comes the fallout. But point being, this was a momentary lapse in judgment of one sentence, really, that came out of his mouth in the middle of a rant, which he was known for, and an iconic staple of something that couldn't be any less Canadian, all of a sudden is gone. So it's treacherous, right? There's it, and so this makes me nervous, but I think we can help you kind of wade through it and give you some guidance and give you some support in how to understand it. And so when I say, like, obviously that, we've talked about some things in my slides that are clearly in the X zone, the things that are not professional. And Amanda gave you a lot of examples and about how to be professional and what professionalism is. But as we know, it's not a clear line in the sand. There's a bit of a gray area, and really, I call it the messy middle. And that gets tricky. And let me give you an example of a really simple example of how something can look very different. So we look at this slide. I read that. If I didn't have the picture of the crocodile, I don't know what I would think that meant. If I put the picture of the crocodile beside it, that looks kind of concerning. Oh, sorry, maybe you can't see that. You see it now? But if we change a few subtle things, for instance, so there's the sentence. We had the crocodile. Without the crocodile, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. With the crocodile, I'm pretty sure I know what you're saying. I'm kind of appalled by it. But we make a little bit of an adjustment. We put a comma in there. That makes a little clearer to me, I think, about what you're saying. And then we add a little bit more context. And it's like, oh yeah, I get this. This is not concerning at all. But if you just post the first black box to social media, somebody can read that and be very, very concerned about that. And so, how do we figure out what conduct is going to be in the check mark or the X box? And I think there's some really easy ways to sort of think of sort of navigate that. And one of the things is to look at the legislation and your regulations with respect to your college. So, for instance, in the Registered Nurses Act, and most of the colleges have very similar legislation in this province. In Section 18, they define what conduct deserving of sanction is. And Section 18C sub I speaks of professional misconduct. That's that professionalism in the workplace, the stuff Amanda was really focusing in on. And even when she was talking about the social media, the pictures from within the workplace, the videos from within the workplace, those kind of things. Section 18 sub III speaks to conduct and becoming. Conduct and becoming is that outside the workplace conduct, the kind of stuff we've been talking about. And then there's sort of the catch-all category, which 18C V or 5, which is a catch-all of saying you acted in contrary of the code of ethics or the standards of practice or the act or the regulations. So there's some clues of, some guidance of what the big buckets are that you need to steer clear of. You don't want to fall into a professional misconduct. You don't want to fall into behavior that's considered conduct unbecoming. We've already talked about how the code of ethics and your standards of practice are your guide rails or your guardrails, and they set the sort of parameters. And so know those. Be aware of some of the specific things that are in your legislation and your regulations. For instance, um, it is mandatory in most of the professional college legislation in this province that if you are convicted of a criminal offense, convicted, not charged, if you are convicted of a criminal offense, you must report that to your college. And some legislation says if the director in my role receives one of those reports, they must deal with it as an allegation. So make sure you make those phone calls, make sure you report those things. Clearly in the regulations, it says you must have a license to practice. If you fail to have an active practicing license and you practice your profession, you will be subject to an allegation. Some of those things get very defined in your regulations or in your bylaws. So there are some, broad direction in sort of those buckets of conduct deserving of sanction in the Act, and then they get defined. And for instance, the College of Registered Nurses defines each of those 5 buckets in Section 18 in their bylaws. So that'll give you some idea of what things would cause you to be found guilty of conduct deserving of sanction as a result of professional misconduct or conduct unbecoming. So know those things, be aware of those things. And of course, um, and at least that gives you a starting point. There's always going to be conduct, comments are always going to be subject to interpretation. And that's where you need to sort of sit down and prepare yourself and sort of think about things like values, attitudes, motivation. So going back to our Let's Eat Kids example, if someone reads that and they are a mother of a family of 5 and they have a strong value that every night we sit down as a family at 6 o'clock and we eat dinner as a group, fail nothing, almost impossible in the real world, but let's say, if that's your value, you probably would read that and have 100% gone to the fact that this is a mom calling kids to dinner. And you would probably go back to a mom calling kids to dinner. Attitude is part of it, right? Let's say you're just a skeptic and you're trolling the internet and you're looking for people to, sort of, you've just got that cranky attitude today and you're being skeptical about everything. Then maybe you would look at it and criticize someone's grammar, say it's missing a comma, and, hear someone posting about, cannibalism. Problematic. Motivation's one of it. If I have someone who's gunning for me, somebody that doesn't like me, doesn't respect me, and they're looking for every opportunity that I might trip up, they're going to jump on something I put on social media or jump on a comment I make. And, they're going to be writing letters to professional practice. Doesn't necessarily make it right, doesn't necessarily make it wrong either. um, People's awareness. Like one of the things, like I do a little bit of work for a group in BC, and they are so much further along in the journey with respect to creating culturally safe spaces and the truth and reconciliation work than some of the other jurisdictions. Be aware. The word stakeholder is not appropriate. It is a colonial word referring to how the European settlers came and staked land to take land away from our indigenous communities. And so, being aware that this word that we've used endlessly in um, business in particular, particularly healthcare, when we're talking about community partners, we often refer to them as community stakeholders. Be aware that that's no longer really the acceptable term. And that ties into experience, right? Had I not had the opportunity to be engaged in a project that sort of spanned multiple provinces and connected to a jurisdiction where that truth and reconciliation work is really at the center of what they're doing for obvious reasons, I might not have been had that awareness. So, and be aware other people have experiences. So, some of those examples I think that Amanda gave, some of that's experience related, right? Like if you've had a family member in care and they suffer from dementia, that Ativan comment's going to hit you hard and you're going to be far more sensitive to it than someone who hasn't had that same experience. So be mindful of other people's experiences and be mindful of your own experiences. And part of this is equipping yourself with knowledge, which is really a compilation of all of these things. But the other thing is there's external factors, right? Context. Where are you? If I'm standing beside the alligator pond and I say, let's eat kids, well, or if my others standing beside, picture of my kids, sort of, the context around where you are will lead people in a direction when they're interpreting your behavior. So be careful of your context. I mean, the setting you're in, that's part of context. So be mindful of your setting, right? If you're going to post a social picture to social media, right? Like thinking of the teacher situation that an example that Amanda gave, think of your setting. Like, where are you? What are you doing? What are people now sort of left to interpret about you, your values, your attitudes, your professionalism, your dedication, all those things. So, all of those things result in the way others interpret your actions or your comments. And so it's being mindful that not everybody's coming at things from the same place you are. I think the trickiest part of this whole myriad of things that impacts interpretation can be social norms. And again, this is from Michelle Carpenter. Um, social norms continually shift. Those goalposts are moving and they're moving fast. I mean, the stakeholder comment is an example. I mean, and we're dealing with this now, right? Because people are looking backwards in history and saying, all these revered leaders or schools named after historical figures. We're moving away from those things because we're looking backwards at people and judging them through a social lens of 2024, and the context of even 20 years ago is very, very different. So it is being aware of those shifting social norms and not ignoring those things. It's the pronoun piece, right? Like that 20 years ago, if I had put what my pronouns after a signature on my email address, people eh, wouldn't even have understood what I was trying to communicate, right? So these things change, they shift, and we need to make sure we're aware um, and we're current in our knowledge. Here's an example. So again, this shows my vintage, the show All in the Family, and I do realize that this show was actually designed to bring forward into popular culture an awareness around things like equality and and to shed light on the challenges that issues like racism were causing. But when I read this, I was like, "Oh, I don't even know." Like, I don't even know if you could put this kind of commentary anywhere in current day and not have it have some, raise some eyebrows and cause some issues. So the story is that, Archie Bunker's neighbor, who's female, is upset that she's not earning as much at her job as her male counterparts, despite doing the same work. And Archie's comment, after all, it's well known men are worth more than women, which he backs up by saying, in the Bible, it says God made man in his own image. He made women after from a cheaper cut. you know, it's it's appalling. Even the religious content of that would probably raise issue with some individuals at this point in 2024. But then he goes on to say, equality is unfair. What's the point of being a man and working hard on my life if I'm just going to end up equal? So, you know, that was out on popular TV, primetime TV for a laugh in the 70s. I said, and there were other examples that I couldn't even put on the screen because the content was so offensive. And not that they were promoting it, but it was what was happening in people's living rooms that they were trying to draw attention to. So those shifting social norms are also something we really need to pay attention to. So how do you navigate all of this, right? Because now that I've got you all afraid to even like anything on social media, how do we help you navigate this sort of messy middle, and what can we do to equip you and give you guidance and support as you sort of move through life as a regulated healthcare professional? Well, I'm gonna use the analogy of trying to drive I'm new to St. John's in the last few years. You would not drive in this town in spring, summer during scratch and patch season, and just put yourself on autopilot because that's just gonna lead you into all sorts of trouble and frustration. So my first word of advice is move forward with intention. Be thoughtful. Don't mindlessly repost things. Don't mindlessly post things. Don't do things out of reaction. Don't respond out of frustration. Don't write that email when you're angry, stick it in the draft box with nothing in the to line and let it sit there overnight and think about it before you send those things. You know, it's that pause before you post, think before you act, and move forward with intention. You know, you wouldn't put your car on autopilot and try and navigate up, um, you know, a street under construction, because it's going to cause you problems. Um, have knowledge, get the knowledge, right? We've already talked about this. Be aware of what's going on with the shifting social norms. Know what your standards of practice say. Know what your code of ethics say. You know, go to our website. We post all our disciplinary decisions. Many regulated professions all of us have to post some, results of hearings if there's a suspension. Some post everything. Some post things anonymously, and we post them anonymously not because we want you to play a guessing game and try and figure out which registered professional was guilty of that conduct. It's so that you can see, oh, that was a problem. When that person breached confidentiality in that way, that became a concern for the regulator. So equip yourself with knowledge. Know what things have been considered unprofessional. Know where you can go to get questions answered about what's professional. Um, and so, and be aware. So, you know, watch those that go before you. You wouldn't, if you're driving down the road, it's always, you know, when you're having trouble seeing, weather's bad, the roads are slippery, there's potholes, you know, watch where the car in front of you goes. If they jog left all of a sudden, there's probably a reason, right? So watch the folks around you, watch the media, not just in healthcare, in other professions, in other jurisdictions, to see what things are being looked upon, what things are under the microscope, where are people being called out as being unprofessional and being held accountable to those things. um, you know, use the guidelines. um, you know, there's practice documents, there's advisory statements, there's FAQs on websites, there's your professional practice resource people in your colleges that you can pick up the phone and call. There's your discipline people. You can call us and have conversations and say, listen, I'm having a tough time navigating this. I don't really know where to go with it. So use those resources, and that does include your colleagues. You know, bounce things off them, but you make sure you're bouncing and using solid resources. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about being mindful, be intentional, think, use your knowledge, use your resources, follow your guidelines, know the boundaries, And that way, oops, I guess you can't see that one. It said push to you. Anyway, so these, like I say, these are the tips and things that I think you need to remember. And if you can equip yourself well to navigate the messy middle, then you will, at the end of the day, create conduct and communication and put yourself out there in a way that leads to a reduced risk of misinterpretation, so that when you do decide to step forth, if you feel like you need to get involved with making a statement of some kind, it's clear what your intention is and it's not open to interpretation.
Thanks, Brenda. That was a great presentation. So today, the panelists have provided us some very thought-provoking images, memes, and commentary on professionalism and the need to maintain professionalism in the workplace while engaging in social media and other settings. We learned about ethical drift, which is a new term for me and maybe others, and the need to address ethical drift. A takeaway from the panelists is that professionalism is at the core of healthcare professionals' professional practice. And healthcare professionals need to be mindful of what it means to be a professional and the requirement to demonstrate professionalism in all of our interactions. And the panelists also gave us some really great key strategies for demonstrating professionalism and establishing and maintaining professional boundaries. So we're now going to turn it back to Annette to do another polling question, and then we'll move into our scenarios.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. And just to kind of sum up too, people talked, the panelists talked a lot about different practice resources, and it came up in the group chat, but I just want to let you know there's links and PDFs of practice resources and links to our standards and guidelines for our professions in the resource section on the webinar platform. So you can hop on over there and access some of those resources. So our last polling question before we jump into the case scenarios is, do professionals have an ethical responsibility to provide clients, patients, service users with their first and last name in the context of service delivery? So again, ask that you reflect on that question and answer yes, no, or unsure. And then we'll have an opportunity for the panelists to come back on and kind of provide some commentary on that question. So I'll just give it a few minutes and you can ponder that for a little while, and we'll look forward to seeing your responses around that. So Simone, Amanda, and Brenda, I invite you to come back on to turn your cameras back on and come back on and provide some commentary around this once all the polling is completed. Again, we'll just give it a few seconds just to make sure everyone gets a chance to provide their response. Okay. A few more minutes. There is a little delay, like I said earlier, so we'll just give a few more seconds. Okay, I think everyone's had an opportunity, so we'll just push those results to the audience. So 77.65% indicated yes, you do have to provide your first and last name. 11.73% said no, and 10.61% said unsure. So I'll hand it back to the panelist, and Simone, we'll start with you if you want to provide some commentary.
Absolutely. So since we are a regulated professional, yeah, it's absolutely required and really part of the nature of informed consent and respecting the inherent worth and dignity of all persons and the right to autonomy and self-determination, that we provide our full names and even our registration number. And therefore, as we're accountable to the public and for the protection of the public, that a client or a patient does have a mechanism or a way to pursue any avenue around a dispute or complaint.
Excellent. Thanks, Simone. Amanda, did you have any comment on this?
So I think, what we've been talking about over the last hour or so is about professionalism. And it is professional for you to have your ID with both your first and last name, and the client has a right to know who is providing that care. We've seen IDs with stickers over people's faces, last names scratched out, right? So that's not professional. And if we think back to that person and family centered care approach, it's just respectful, right? So I think if we keep those things in mind, it'll help guide us.
Excellent. Thanks, Amanda. And Brenda.
From a regulatory lens, there is an obligation in the Act and the regulations for individuals to update their information with the regulator within 30 days of any change. So, for instance, when it comes to names, sometimes what we see is someone who's had one last name, and then maybe they get married or divorced, or there's this change, and they may change it with the employer so that their employer ID has one name, or their paychecks coming in a name, and their shift schedules going in a name. But maybe when they do their annual registration, they're like, oh, so much work to change my name with the regulator. I got to go find my marriage certificate. And so they leave their registration in a different name. And just so you know, that's problematic. You actually are required to update the information with the regulator within 30 days. That includes change of name, address, and I think phone numbers listed in there, but for contact information and certainly your name and your place of employment. So when you change jobs, you should be going into your regulator sort of portals, or however you update that personal contact information. That's a critical piece of your responsibility.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. And there is a practice resource for social workers that might be helpful for everyone online to have a look at as well, but it's in the resource section on the platform called Professional Identity and Ethical Practice. So that's over there if you want to have a look at that in terms of, explaining the rationale why it's important that clients know who, is their healthcare provider or their service provider, and being able to link that with the registration. And so that's very important. So thank you. So in keeping with time, we'll just move on now to our case scenarios, and I'll invite Wanda Squires with the College of Licensed Practical Nurses to come on, where she is there now, to moderate and facilitate the case scenario discussions.
Thank you so much for that. So this is all very relevant and fantastic information that we've been hearing here today. So now that you've had some time to reflect upon the information that's been given, I'd like to run through some scenarios, some case scenarios with you. So the first case scenario is Chris works in community care. One of Chris's clients is a 24-year-old male who was recently diagnosed with depression. Chris also has depression, however, it's managed with medications and self-care techniques. Chris wonders if it's appropriate to talk to his client about his medical history and the journey with depression, and share information on the treatments that he has received that he has found that were effective. So I'd like to ask the panelists for a response, and I'll start with Amanda for your response.
Sure. So I think in this case, it really is blurring the lines between professionalism and maybe a friend. Right? So I think sometimes in our smaller sites, that can be really challenging. You know everybody who's coming in, they probably all know you. And sometimes it's really easy to say, listen, you know what? I took this medication, it worked really well for me. I did find it had a side effect. But we have to be very careful between those lines of friendships or people we know and professionalism. And we have to keep that really clear, because in this case, he came to see Chris as a professional. And so he's looking for that professional approach and professional advice. And sometimes when we get into our personal situations, it can be seen as giving advice as a social worker or as a registered nurse or licensed practical nurse. So we have to be really cautious. And I think back to an example where a lady, who knew someone very well had just said, I don't think I'd take my daughter into emergency room yet if it was me. And because they were, known to be a registered nurse, they took it as advice from a registered nurse, and it became very complex. So I think, the easiest thing to do there is just to steer clear, use one of those little, well, in this case, maybe don't go there, right? Don't go down into those personal weeds, and just keep it into that professional boundary.
Thank you, Amanda. Simone, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So I will draw attention for the social workers that we do have a practice matters document called self-disclosure. Did I say so much? Or did I say too much? And it does cover a lot of the facets of uh, what is required maybe to think about when determining whether or not to use self-disclosure as a therapeutic technique. Some questions to consider might be how much self-disclosure is appropriate, what are the risks and the benefits, whose needs are being met, and how might the social worker client relationship be impacted, right? So it was raised that it can blur the boundaries and can become almost like a drifting into kind of confusing where the boundaries lie between a personal opinion versus a professional opinion, and how a person might receive that information and act on it. And I also, in reflecting on this before our talk today, was thinking about in our standards of practice in the code that social workers are to act with impartiality. And we don't know necessarily all of the facets around that particular person's medical needs. So if I were a social worker in this position, like Chris, talk about medication really is not within my scope of practice. And for me to offer an opinion would be professionally inappropriate. That's to be between the client and their healthcare provider, the prescribing professional. So it's also important to take into consideration how we are to remain impartial and not influence our clients in a direction that may ultimately not be helpful for them.
Right. Yeah, great points there, Simone. Brenda, would you like to add anything to this?
You know what? I agree with the comments from both my predecessors. I think there's a couple of issues here. One is scope of practice for sure. You need to be clear that you're staying within your scope. And if you're not a physician or a nurse practitioner or someone who's has a scope of practice to provide a diagnosis and recommend a prescription medication, let's say, if that's what was going on in this case, steer clear of that, because that's outside your scope of practice. And I think it also is the client relationship piece. I know sometimes, it's very tempting because you want to establish that bond with your client, and you want to build a relationship of trust. And sometimes that, hey, I'm in the trenches with you thing is a really seemingly easy and way to sort of build that relationship with someone. But be careful, because the other thing is your focus is you're the caregiver, they're the client. And if you shift that dynamic and all of a sudden it becomes all about you, now you're taking away, right? So let's be clear what hat you're wearing when you're in the space. And you're right, Amanda, I've worked in so many small jurisdictions, and it is so hard because it's the people that are in your circle of care. And my other word of advice is, if someone does come to you and wants to have those conversations, you know what? Steer clear, advise them to have conversations with other people. But if you're going to have any kind of conversation about someone, just preface it and say, listen, we're talking as friends here. We're in the kitchen. Do not do it in the hallway at the hospital when you bump into them. Do not do it when you are on shift and you are providing care to them. Steer clear of them altogether, but be very clear if someone's really pushing you, and tell them, I don't feel comfortable having this conversation because, it's not the role that I have with you. I'm not your care provider. That's not within my scope of practice. So and that was one of my big takeaways. I liked Amanda, and have a line. Be prepared for these things. When you work in small communities, you need to have that response ready so that you're not kind of stuck or
Mhm.
caught flat-footed.
Right. Thank you so much. I think it's really important that we're mindful of those therapeutic boundaries as well. And I think you all certainly covered that in your response. So thank you. The next scenario that we have here for you is Karen works at a community health center, and a former client of Karen's reaches out to her on Facebook to discuss a personal health care issue. Karen wonders how best to address this situation. So I'm going to turn it over to Simone to start this conversation.
Okay, I will also refer to another explanatory document on the NLCSW website as a resource for social workers. Um, and its title is Technology Use in Social Work Practice. And that actually lists out several best practices for technology use. And I guess the first thing I think about right away is that this was a past client, right? So when you think about initially, right, at the onset of the therapeutic relationship, this is one of the things through the process of informed consent that you might discuss about what are the avenues in which you would receive contact from a client if they want to reach out, right? And talk about the risks of confidentiality to advise a client if they were to contact me through Facebook that I can't guarantee confidentiality. And my role as a professional is to fiercely guard their confidentiality. So the best way for me to be contacted would be, by telephone, for example. And so the document that I mentioned actually goes into kind of how you can set up having a kind of a social media policy with your clients through the process of informed consent to deal with these matters up front. Kind of like a risk management tool, really, for ourselves in order to prepare our clients should something like that occur. So the work needs to be done beforehand. But once you've already received that message, then in consideration of confidentiality, it might be the most productive thing to redirect the person to the originally discussed way of contact. Yeah, so that's basically what
Good.
I would consider.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Brenda next to speak from the regulatory side of things.
Well, I'm going to say social media is kind of the bane of my existence in most instances. So, but it's tricky, right? Because again, people like either this is a client or maybe it's someone who hasn't been a client but knows you're a professional. Like, I mean, people will reach out because, not everybody has a family doctor and not everybody wants to go sit and emerge and all those things. So we get into these situations where we're all of a sudden accessible to whole numbers of people that otherwise we wouldn't be accessible to. And I 100% agree with the have a plan beforehand, right? Be clear and look at your organizational policies, because some regulators will have clear guidelines that, text, because some of this has got to do with documentation. So, text communication, email communication, what are the policies in general about that? And we used to struggle with this. I worked in a personal care home, and our physicians loved when the staff would text them. And we were like, stop texting the physicians because there's no way to document it. There's no way for us to capture that. So be aware of what the policies are in your organization, for one thing. And then again, I think the key with this one is this, particularly in the fact that this is a former client. I agree with you might sort of say, listen, if you need help imminently, I'm going to suggest you go to the emerge department or the on-call emergency social worker or whatever the appropriate, emergent care sort of provider is. Anything else that can wait, I'm going to suggest call your family doctor or follow up with your current care provider or whatever, and just push them in the right direction of the appropriate resource that they need.
Thank you. And Amanda, would you like to weigh in on that?
I guess just a few thoughts come to mind, around maintaining that therapeutic client relationship. And now we're really going over that boundary into your personal social media accounts. And I'm seeing some comments around social media here in our chat group. I think it is important to put those safeguards in place through our social media that helps us to maybe be a little less identifiable. There were some good suggestions there, but even leaving your name off of your Facebook account, your last name off your Facebook account. Keep it on your ID, but maybe take it off your social media account. Just some food for thought. But I think it goes back to the things my colleague said about redirecting, so and having that sense that I don't deal with work issues on my social media. If you're concerned, perhaps call 811 or emergency room. That's up to you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move along to scenario 3. So Jane works in long-term care. One of the residents who has mild dementia was recently diagnosed with cancer. In a team discussion on how to talk to the client about their diagnosis, one of the staff members laughs and says that the client won't remember the conversation anyway, and to just have the conversation with the client's daughter. Jane is becoming increasingly frustrated with the jokes and comments about residents at the home and wonders if she should speak up. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda first to get started.
So I think she should absolutely speak up. We have those requirements to be advocators, for our clients, and standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. So important. And going back to those comments, I guess, in my presentation about calling the behavior, oh my gosh, that's awful, Melanie. Think about what you're saying, or even just saying, that's so disrespectful, or maybe the opposite. Let's keep it respectful now, guys. Just kind of bringing it back. And I do think that persistent problems, you do need leadership involvement to have those conversations and talk about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Because the first time you hear a comment like that, it's shocking. But by the time you've heard it 30 times, it's the norm. So it really goes back to that first time it happens, calling the behavior.
That's right. Brenda, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, 100% I agree. I think Amanda's, covered really the salient point on this is absolutely speak up. And again, as she said in her presentation, I would have no hesitation in a group meeting saying something, hey, let's keep it respectful. And if it persists, then maybe it's pulling the person aside and say, hey, listen, I've tried to not throw you under the bus in front of everybody, and I don't want to do it in front of everybody, but we need to have a conversation because this isn't sitting well with me. And then I guess the bigger picture, is keep in mind if something like this escalates or crosses over into that category of conduct deserving of sanction, there's duty to report to your regulator, right? So, and I know that technically, in some instances, registrants have been told that if they, bring the matter to a manager or report it to a supervisor, that's meets their requirement as far as their duty to report under the legislation. Technically, that's not true. Technically, your duty is to report to the college if you see someone engaging in what could be considered conduct deserving of sanction. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the one to file the complaint form, but you do have to pick up the phone and make a call and report that. So, and I think the reason that's becoming very front and center again, and a bit of a shift from that, well, as long as you tell your manager it's okay, is because of the wetlaw situation wherein, people were reporting her to employers were taking action, but where you have people who are working in a for-profit industry, there might not be motivation by the employer to report to the college and deal with the media attention of it. So just, on a low level, yes, be the leader, stand up, say the right thing. This happens in hockey dressing rooms, this should be happening. It should be happening everywhere. We should be holding each other accountable for inappropriate comments and behaviors. But if it escalates to conduct deserving sanction, there is a duty to actually report to the regulator.
That's great. Thank you. And Simone, would you like to carry on? Oh, you're on mute there, Simone.
Sorry about that. Thanks. I've got another plug for the NLCSW website. We do have a document for the guiding framework for social workers concerned about professional practice of a colleague. And I, of course, would just want to reinforce all of the things that have been said by my colleagues today. And there is now a requirement in the section of our Social Work Act to a duty to report as well when we observe the unprofessional behavior of a colleague. The decision-making framework that's outlined in our framework guide is clearly identify the issue, speak directly with the colleague, encourage the colleague to take whatever actions necessary or to elevate it again up the chain of command if necessary, to keep into consideration agency policies and procedures, and then of course the necessity and now the legal requirement if it does meet the standard for formal reporting to our regulatory body.
That's great. It certainly sounds like all three regulatory colleges here have the duty to report outlined in certainly legislation. And just to add that, Simone, you mentioned that the College of Social Workers has the resolving like professional practice issues. The College of Registered Nurses and the College of Licensed Practice Nurses also have similar documents. So it's great. I mean, we're all on the same page with these things. It's good. Thank you very much for your responses. I'm going to move along to the next one. The fourth scenario is Megan works in an inpatient care. A client learns that Megan is in the process of having her house painted. The client tells Megan that he is a house painter and offers to do this work for $1,000 less than what she was quoted. Megan wonders what to do. So Brenda, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Of course you would. This one's trickier, right? Like, let's be honest, right? There doesn't seem to be any conflict of interest between, a client who may be your patient today, who runs a business and is looking to provide you with an unrelated service. But it gets into those professional boundary pieces. First of all, that's the first piece is, don't mix your personal life with your professional life if you can help it. Keep those clear lines straight because I don't know why this person is in an inpatient unit. But, they may, if it's someone, say, having chemotherapy, you're going to have an ongoing relationship with them. And so mixing your personal life with your professional life is not a good plan. And I think the other piece of this is always the optics of it. We struggled with this particularly in long-term care. Families want to come in at Christmas and they want to bring things for the staff and sometimes they have a particular nurse that's looked after their loved one and they want to bring a special gift for that person and these get really difficult because the optics then are, and whether consciously or unconsciously, are people going to provide a higher level of care or individualized attention or bend a rule or sort of give an extra bit of something to a particular client. And so it's maintaining that objective stance and it's making sure that people see you as being neutral and fair and equitable to all. So, in my mind, this is a no. I would just steer clear of it altogether.
Simone, would you like to go next?
Yes, I think this highlights the issue of, the complexity of dual relationships and conflicts of interest in our role. And the ethics committee, in our ethical compass, did a talk and then a little bit of a discussion, and then put together a document in June of 2022 called Balancing Personal Interests in Professional Practice. And there we talk about a number of things just to think about, right? When something like this happens, will the situation have an impact on my professional relationship with my client? Am I placing the client first, or am I motivated by my own needs? Could professional boundaries be impacted? Can I explain the rationale for my decision based on an ethical decision making process? Would I consider it reasonable for another social worker to make a similar decision? And are there alternative options that exist? How might this be perceived by the client? And how might this situation be viewed by my colleagues or employer? And how would I document this decision? So there's some more questions just to add and reinforce the feedback by the other two panelists.
Right, thank you. And I'll come to Amanda.
I think this reminds me of the messy middle slide that was shared, because it's a tangly one. And I think of it sometimes in smaller areas where we all know each other. And, how did the person come to know that I was painting my house? Maybe that's another question, right? Was it an overshare moment? Was I explaining that, I didn't have very much money, I was going through a divorce and I need to get my house painted? It's hard to know in some of those from the black and white scenario, but it really looks at, I guess, that conflict of interest piece. And do we want our client in our home now painting our house and knowing that we've been given a good deal? And to Brenda's point earlier, we've seen some of that on the floor where I'm concerned about mom's how she's being taken care of after I'm gone, and so we're providing gifts and things to staff. And we do have some policies around that in the legacy organizations. Again, we have nothing pulled together from NLHS yet, but I think those things will come. And it goes back to the professional asking, is this really that gray step, right? Is this the step that I want to take here today?
Great. Thank you so much for your responses. I'm just looking at time here. So I'll read out the next case scenario. And this one's with rising work demands and limited staff. Paul, a healthcare professional, is falling behind on documentation. And to catch up, he writes limited notes and documents care that has not happened. When asked by his supervisor, Paul asserts that all the documentation is completed, accurate, and up to date. What are some of the ethical considerations? So I'll pass it over to Simone to start.
All right, so immediately in this section, we do have an issue of an ethical violation, as documenting care that hasn't occurred is not promoting the qualities of honesty, reliability in our professional practice. So that's probably the first thing to highlight there, in that and limited notes. Okay, so all right. So I think of these situations in terms of kind of negotiables and non-negotiables. A non-negotiable is that we must absolutely, in the spirit of integrity, document what has occurred and not document which has not occurred. But in times of extreme pressure, the important thing to do is to bring the issue around limited time to supervision or management, and again, honesty is the best policy. Lay it out. I'm time limited. I'm not able to get to the things, to the care that may be required, and to be open and transparent with your employer or your supervisor, and then work out a plan together about how to prioritize what must be done, and then how that can be documented.
Great. And I'll pass it over to Amanda for some commentary.
To Simone's point about the black and white pieces, false documentation, right? It's not acceptable, period. And it goes back to that integrity thing that we talked about. Documenting something you didn't do. It's not only professional, it's breaches of standards, policies, and it can lead to inaccurate care is the other piece of this, right? There's a risk to the client in that false documentation. And, so blood pressure has been fine for the last 4 checks. I'm sure it's fine this time, and you document it. You are accountable for that action, not somebody else. It's you. And saying I was busy is not going to stand up in court, right? It's your professional integrity and accountability here that's on the line. And when it comes to, I guess, those brief notes, sometimes people write stories, right? Put a lot of stuff in their note, and some people don't put enough. But we need to make sure those key pieces of information are in our documentation. And there are days when we are all just slammed and you don't get a chance to write your note the way you wanted to. I worked in ICU as a nurse, and lots of times my note was on the back of a 2x2 of what happened. And it wasn't until after, when sometimes you were late working, you had to take that now and transform that into a note that told the story of what happens with the patient. It happens. It's not every single shift that you can't get any documentation done, but it does happen. And so try to work through those processes. But at the end of the day, there's standards and policies that we're accountable for. And as a professional, we have to maintain those standards.
Thank you, Amanda. Brenda, would you like to have a final comment there?
Yeah, just real quick, because I know we're tight on time. CRNNL does have a documentation principles document, guiding document available for professionals. So that's one thing. Use your professional practice, people, if you're having challenges. And then my cover-all comments are honesty is the best policy. So never document something that didn't happen, and never lie about what you've documented or not documented. Don't lie about anything, that, because I'm telling you, when we get complaints in, the ones that there is no wiggle room on are the people who have misled the investigator or not been transparent in the investigation process. I mean, we don't necessarily get into all of the employer policy things. So like if we get a complaint about somebody's, an example I used to say, let's say someone was smoking on the property, we wouldn't necessarily, that's not conduct deserving of sanction that the college is worried about. But sometimes what happens is because someone's terminated or suspended because of that kind of behavior, there's a duty to report that's triggered, and we get a complaint form anyway. And most of the time, the committee will look at that and say, that's not the regulator's domain. We're not going to get involved. That's an employer issue. But if they've lied during the investigation, it all of a sudden becomes my domain, and we will get involved. So please don't lie. And go to your managers. Go to them with problems. Say, I'm struggling. Don't wait for them to come to you and say, are you struggling? Because I think you might be. Way easier to be proactive and say, listen, I'm being accountable. I'm feeling like I've not got the resources, whatever it is, to meet the standards of practice that are expected of me. I need to help, and I need to put you on notice for that, because I need either help, support, or I need you to help me figure out why I'm not able to get myself there.
Great. Thank you all so much. The regulators' websites, so whichever type of profession that you're in, has a lot of great information. And on the websites, we're all about promoting good practice and preventing poor practice from happening. So I do encourage each of you here today to go to your respective regulator websites to have a look at the documentation, the documents that are available to help support what good practice looks like and so on. So I'm going to pass it over to Annette before we clue up here today.
Yeah, we did. We purposely went through with the different case scenarios we had because we weren't getting a lot of questions in. So in the essence of time, one of the questions that did come in was around the recording. So yes, the session is being recorded and will be up on our respective websites in the next week or so. So just to answer that question. And I know we're gone past our time, so I'm going to turn it back to Kelly, who will provide some concluding remarks for us.
Thanks, Annette. So as we stated at the beginning of today's event, our goal was to highlight some of the ethical and practice consideration as it relates to professionalism and provide an opportunity for knowledge exchange, reflection, and learning. I think today really highlighted what healthcare professionals need to know and why professionalism matters. Thanks again to our wonderful panel and for sharing your knowledge, expertise, and experience with us today. And to assist with planning for the next collaborative education session in 2025, we are asking that you complete the evaluation form before you leave the webinar. And social workers attending this session may claim 2 CPE credits under the workshop category as per the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers continuing professional education policy. And if you are a registered nurse and you still require hours before the renewal deadline, you can log this in My Learning in the Alinity member portal. And LPNs can also use today's session as 2 CCP hours, and be sure to log it on your record of learning form. And all 3 of the regulatory colleges have a number of resources pertaining to professionalism, and they can be found on our websites using the following links. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.